Hello everyone, and thank you for attending this presentation. I very much wish I could be there with you today. This conference is an important one because it deals with health and the planning and politics of how and where we live. Our health and how we live in our homes and streets can't be divorced, and the health issues connected to the built environment are also a social and political problem. That's what this presentation is about, specifically about the living conditions for the most needy among us, the homeless. This presentation study will relate spaces within homeless shelters to health factors and introduce a new emerging tool that allows designers and their clients of places like shelters and permanent housing to take into consideration human psychological needs of their residents. It's the intent that this checklist that I'm about to present to you will help designers make choices of how to create physical environments that help their residents recover even better. My name is Jill Pable, and I am with Florida State University in the Department of Interior Architecture and Design. I'm also the project lead for a nonprofit organization called Design Resources for Homelessness. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in just a bit. But first, a brief introduction to the issue of homelessness is probably in order here, specifically within the United States, which is where this research took place. Homelessness is a persistent and pervasive problem and affects the community fabric in many areas of my country. Despite the United States' first world status, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development reported in their 2016 point-in-time count that on any given night, 549,000 people, and that's a conservative estimate, were experiencing homelessness. That happens to be a number that's larger than the population of Tucson, Arizona. Despite federal spending of about $5.5 billion annually on targeted programs, the last 10 years have only reduced the homeless population by about 100,000 individuals, which is about a 15% increase. While that's terrific, obviously we have much more to do. American organizations provide a diversity of accommodation options for people that are homeless, such as emergency shelters for nightly entrance, transitional shelters that provide housing from 3 months to a year, and supportive housing that offers a permanent rent-controlled apartment, often with on-site services and counseling. In this way, the built environment operates as one of many of the recovery tools alongside other intervention programs and education and training. These photos that you see here are some of the shelters, transitional housing, and permanent supportive housing that I have visited across the United States in service to creating case studies for design resources for homelessness within the last several years. In many of these cases, residents themselves seem to be rarely asked their opinions of the accommodation style. Yet, the outcomes of residents and how well they recover are quite often the main data points driving the style and shape of treatments that they receive. In my opinion, architecture is not yet a full partner in the prescription for healing that it could be at this point in time. One primary goal for architectural space probably should be stress reduction, and this is a fairly new idea that we need to examine much more fully. Examining and addressing stress and associated trauma is probably very important because it can interfere with people's ability to work to build or maintain their social connections. Research suggests that without addressing the impact of trauma, it will be difficult, in fact, to solve the issue of homelessness. Put another way, we need to identify and react to psychological stressors before we can hope to alleviate homelessness. Psychological stressors directly relate to hormone and other chemical releases in the brain that can trigger depression, violence, and other reactions, which can often, in turn, complicate a person's ability to find a home and a permanent home and a job. This study looked at a particularly important architectural space for persons experiencing homelessness, and that is their private bedroom quarters within emergency and transitional shelters. This seemed a logical place to start as I developed this checklist tool, given that the point was to develop something that would help architectural designers to design with psychological sensitivities in mind. The results from previous interviews that I've conducted with residents of these sorts of places suggest that sleeping spaces are an important architectural place to them because this is the only personal and private space that they really have. Residents typically spend the most time within the shelter in sleeping spaces, and when I asked them what improvements they wished for, They consistently identify problems with these spaces and reported that it can be a stressful situation to sleep there. Privacy, acoustics, sense of safety were all frequently identified concerns. Therefore, sadly, architectural space may actually be a source or a contributor to trauma, in addition to stressors residents are already facing through their joblessness, substance dependency, violence, or other factors. Clearly, we can do better. Based on my on-site surveys of shelters across the United States from 2008 to 2016, emergency and transitional shelters' architectural approach to their sleeping spaces vary a lot. I interviewed directors, facility managers, case managers, and residents, and they revealed multiple priorities and pressures that likely contributed to their design outcomes, such as the attitudes and beliefs of managers about the best procedures for recovery, the pressures of serving the most people possible, and of course, the all-present restricted budgets, which is a particular problem of this sector of design. Some shelters use large room dormitory bunk bed setups, as you see on the left, with no walls or visual barriers, while others use a cluster arrangement of smaller groups of bed, as you see in the middle. Still others use single resident partial wall pods, as you see on the right. The layout of these sleeping spaces can often be a flashpoint for controversy and the focus of newspaper articles and social media that discusses a shelter. And usually the open bay rooms you see on the left are the frequent target of derision. These commentaries describe these large rooms as inhumane or lacking dignity. However, large open sleeping rooms hold attractions for shelter organizations themselves because they're less expensive to build and easier to clean. It also makes monitoring of residents easier for staff, either by arranging office sightlines or surveillance cameras. Others have objected to this surveillance entirely as an invasion of privacy. Through all of this, there appears to be little apparent empirical study devoted to analyzing the various types of sleeping arrangements, much less the perceptions of the residents that must endure these situations. Meanwhile, in the area of mental health, there's also a growing body of inquiry and discussion that probably many of you are very familiar with concerning new best practice policies and philosophical approaches of assisting persons experiencing homelessness. The last 10 years have seen a rise of a less punitive and authoritative approach than before, and now recognizes the importance of engendering trust, reinforcing the presence of safe conditions, and ensuring the inclusion of collaboration and empowerment in policies and engagement. Many multiple health organizations have developed systems that embrace these principles with names such as the CARE model, the ARC model, and the Sanctuary model. In the United Kingdom specifically, the psychologically informed environment movements is currently underway. Collectively, these ideas define a new general movement called trauma-informed care. By extension, trauma-informed design explores ideas for built environments that support the tenets of trauma-informed care. Trauma-informed care's new soft approach has support from a growing body of empirical research, especially as trauma-informed care minimizes stress and maintains or instills a sense of resident empowerment. For example, neurobiological research has established that overwhelming stress, trauma, and neglect particularly impact the parts of the brain that generate thought and memory, and often have long-term effects, sadly, within children. Particular to shelter architecture, the presence of stress from physical environment sources, especially in environments where residents have little control over the surroundings, can contribute a sense of helplessness. Helplessness is a problem for persons who are homeless because this state of mind establishes a barrier to their objectives of securing stable employment and a permanent place to live. In short, this and similar literature suggests that it may be counterproductive to subject persons to a social, mental, and physical environment that instills stress and potentially distracts them from recovery tasks at a time when they are already dealing with a significant crisis. The design of architectural space, including sleeping areas, may have a role to play in residents' level of stress, which may in turn either impede or support their recovery. This exploratory study sought to examine the effectiveness of these three common styles of emergency and transitional shelter sleeping space plans through the lens of a trauma-informed design. This initiative is in line with what others identify through this quote: that there needs to be a way to operationalize these principles and to link these principles to a quantitative measurable change that can be tracked and evaluated. That's what this study really attempts to do. I visited 9 emergency and transitional shelters for this study, and I've observed and photographed their sleeping spaces. Through all of this, 3 primary space plans were what I observed. The choice of these plans is, as I mentioned before, a sense of controversy, as some people find open groups demeaning, while others feel that such openness is critical for surveillance that helps ensure safety. So here's the open plan. There's a plan view on the left, and this sort of style is typified by an open bay, large room with bunk beds, usually of 30 beds or more. About 49 square feet is allotted per person, if you consider 3 feet in front of each bed. The cluster was the second pervasive plan that I observed. This is similar to the open plan, except now the beds are placed in small groups of perhaps 20 that are accessible by specific doors. The approximate square footage per person is the same as the open plan of about 49 square feet per person. The third type was single pods. These are 1 pod per resident without doors. They have a controllable light source, storage, a small refrigerator, and they have more square footage, about 85 square foot per person per pod. So those were the 3 types of spaces that I looked at. This study seeks to document, evaluate, and compare these features of these various arrangements, and in doing so develop an evaluation tool that might enable their assessment in an objective fashion that focuses on the human experience of occupants, which has been often ignored in this whole sector of design. A consensus of literature shows, and as well as previous empirical study, support the identification of a series of human needs. That's the framework that this study used. These 6 human needs or measure support both recovery and resilience for individuals and families impacted by trauma. These ideas, which I'll tell you about in just a second, track closely with the 6 key principles of trauma-informed care that the SAMHSA organization has put together, and also other frameworks such as the WELL standards by the International Well Building Institute. Here are the 6 human needs: dignity, empowerment, security, stress management, sense of community, and beauty and meaning. So the question is, what if we assess the quality of architectural space through the lens of these fundamental human needs for the very people that are using these spaces? Of course, other concerns like cleanability, maintenance, and construction costs still matter, but my main objective was to find a way to really capture these intangible human needs elements, because I believe research is starting to show that they really matter. So the next step in the development of this tool was to flesh out each of these 6 ideas. Here you see the idea for the dignity and self-esteem first feature. So what I did is I went to research and I found ways that might actuate these human needs with some psychological indicators. For example, Miller and Keyes research group suggested that dignity can be enhanced if there's flexibility in rules, and also if an individual's identity might be expressed rather than treating a person as a number. So I pulled out from research of these various sources, what are some ways that architecture could actually get involved with helping to support dignity and self-esteem? After that, I went through all of the 6 indicators, not just dignity and self-esteem, but all of them: security, beauty and meaning, and so forth, and found other indicators as you see in the left-hand column here. The next step then was to go back to my interviews I had done with the residents at these various shelters, and through my dialogue with them, extract out of them what I thought their opinion would be of the 3 different sleeping styles. Now, was this a little bit coming from me at this early stage? Absolutely. But I wanted to have a way to kind of put this emerging tool to the test by interpolating from my residents' interviews what they might have said as a way to test it and then to modify and move the tool forward as we move into the future. So the numbers you see here were ranged from 1 to 5, with 1 being low attendance to that particular indicator and 5 being high attendance to that indicator based on my interviewed residents' perceptions. So I did that for all 6 of the features, all 6 of the human framework features. And this is what I found at the end. I scored up all of them. There were 26 total indicators spread out over the 6 human needs categories. And here you see the totals. You can see that the planned type 3 pods consistently yield the highest average on each of the 6 measures and exceeded the nearest planned type by a point or more on each measure. This may suggest that the more floor space and partitions are affiliated with greater fulfillment of the trauma-informed care measures, as are, it should be mentioned, higher initial construction costs, very likely. Each of the 3 plan types varied a lot in its attendance to the frameworks measured. However, on average, there was about 10% more attendance to the measures as a whole by plan type 2 than plan type 1, and 33% more by plan type 3 than plan type 2. And all total of 43% more by plan type 3, the pods, rather than plan type 1, the open bay. It should be said, though, that none of the 3 plan types really achieved above an academic C on a 10-point grading scale in their total score. It should be mentioned, of course, there are construction cost differences for these 3 options, and also differences in the number of people that can be served among these plan types. None of those differences are currently in the evaluation tool, but they could be added to this checklist as points of comparison, and they probably should be. That said, there are modest gains in trauma-informed care benefits by adhering to a plan type 2, the clusters, when compared to plan type 1, open bay, with only small increases in necessary square footage. Put another way, one can do 10% better on the trauma-informed care measures by grouping the beds into smaller rooms, with only little loss of floor space efficiency and only minor extra construction costs. Previous interviews with residents also revealed other positives associated with the cluster plan option. By sequestering small numbers of bunk beds in separate rooms, people with similar backgrounds or states of wellness can be grouped, helping ensure a more cooperative and sympathetic sense of community. This sense of community probably matters a lot because combating social isolation among this population could be very important. Individuals with low social connections can have altered immune systems, more inflammation, and higher levels of stress hormones. Recent research also indicates that social isolation can increase the risk of heart disease by 29%. So there are hard quantitative numbers that are coming on board that look at combating social isolation, which architecture in turn can either inhibit or support. So this evaluation tool clearly requires further refinement. Here you can see just a portion of it that shows the dignity and self-esteem portion and the empowerment and personal control portion. But this goes on much further. If you'd like to see the tool in its entirety, this will be placed in the papers of the AMPS conference pending their review and approval. Specifically, resident and facility director data applied to this tool would really help triangulate or refute these preliminary findings. Other things probably need to happen too. We probably need to differ the weights applied within the measures or indicators based on other people's feedback. And as I mentioned before, plugging in construction costs, construction times, and maintenance implications are important. However, I would argue this is no less important than understanding architecture's contribution or impediments to resident recovery along these psychological measures. This initial study suggests that bringing the tenets of trauma-informed design to bear in architectural designs and a numerical style analysis may bring to light benefits to that lived, subjective human experience that were previously undocumented or likely undervalued. For this reason, I'm very eager to continue this tool and to further refinement, and I welcome your thoughts or suggestions along these lines. As I wrap up this presentation, I just wanted to mention to you and provide you the URL address for Design Resources for Homelessness, where these and a host of other ideas are available to you at no charge. Here you can download case studies, databases of projects, summaries of research, and a whole host of other things without any delay and again at no charge. So I want to thank you for your attention today, and I appreciate your thoughts and especially your suggestions that might help to make this design evaluation tool better. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope that the conference is wonderful. Take care. Bye-bye.